On the 6th of August, 1964, Flight Lieutenant Taffy Foreman was flying Valiant WP-217 at 30,000 feet over Wales when the starboard wing started to fail. The aircraft sagged visibly to one side. Something major in the structure had let go. Foreman had no way of knowing whether the bomber would hold together long enough to get home. He brought it back to RAF Gaydon with the wing drooping the entire way and somehow landed it. When engineers examined the aircraft afterwards, they found fatigue cracks running through the main spar, the backbone of the wing. The Valiant had been designed for high altitude, where the air is smooth and the loads are predictable. But Soviet missiles had killed the high-altitude mission, and the V-force had been pushed down to low level, where turbulence punished airframes in ways the Valiant was never built to survive. What they found in WP-217 effectively condemned every Vickers Valiant in RAF service. And the most hurtful part of this story is that the RAF had actually built and tested an aircraft that made more sense for low-level work, and then it scrapped it because they thought the mission had become obsolete. To understand how the RAF ended up pushing the Valiant into a role it was never really meant to carry for so long, you have to go back to 1946. The Second World War had left Britain with hundreds of heavy bombers, Lancasters, Halifaxes, the new Avro Lincolns just entering service, and every one of them was sliding toward obsolescence. The Lincoln, then the RAF's most advanced bomber, could manage 310 miles an hour and a ceiling just above 30,000 feet. That wasn't going to cut it in the world that was emerging. So the Air Ministry issued specification B-3546 in 1947 for a jet bomber that could carry a 10,000-pound nuclear weapon at 500 knots at 50,000 feet to a target 1,500 nautical miles. Vickers' submission was, by their own chief designer's description, an unfunny aircraft. George Edwards, who led the design team, didn't pretend the Valiant was going to turn heads. What he promised instead was that he could deliver a bomber that met the specification on time and on budget. The design was conservative. A shoulder-mounted compound sweep wing, 4 Rolls-Royce Avon turbojets buried in the wing roots, nothing that required years of experimental aerodynamic research to prove out. It wasn't as fast as what Avro and Handley Page were proposing. It wasn't as dramatic, but it could be in service years before either of them. The RAF ordered 2 prototypes, and the first one flew on the 18th of May, 1951. Edwards had delivered exactly what he'd promised. But alongside the standard Valiant, the Air Ministry had another idea. Drawing on the RAF's Second World War experience with pathfinder squadrons, aircraft that flew ahead of the main bomber force to mark targets at low altitude, they wanted a variant that could do the same job in the jet age. Specification B-104D called for a medium-range target marker that could operate effectively at low level and high speed. Vickers responded with the Type 673, which became the Valiant B.2. The B.2 had a fundamentally strengthened airframe, new wing spars, redesigned undercarriage relocated into trailing-edge sponsons to avoid weakening the wing structure, a fuselage extension to balance the shifted center of gravity. Where the standard Valiant could manage about 414 miles per hour at sea level, the B-2 could do 582. In testing, it was pushed to 640 miles an hour on the deck, a figure comparable to the American B-1B Lancer, an aircraft that wouldn't fly for another 3 decades. They painted it gloss black. At the 1954 Farnborough Air Show, it earned the nickname the Black Bomber. It was an aircraft built from the ground up for sustained high-speed flight in the dense, turbulent air close to the ground, the kind of flying that tears apart airframes not designed for it. The Air Ministry cancelled the order for 17 production B-2s before the prototype even flew on the 4th of September 1953. The reasoning wasn't about the aircraft itself. Nobody questioned whether Vickers could build it. It was about whether the mission still existed. In the Second World War, pathfinders had been essential because bombing was inaccurate. You needed crews flying ahead at low level to visually identify targets and mark them with flares, so the main force, bombing blind from altitude, had something to aim at. But the new V-bombers were equipped with sophisticated radar bombing systems. Each aircraft could find its own target. The air staff looked at that and concluded, Why risk an aircraft at low level to mark something when the bomber overhead can locate it with radar from 50,000 feet? It was a perfectly logical argument, provided high-altitude bombing remained the doctrine. Nobody seriously questioned that assumption in 1953. Meanwhile, the Standard Valiant was getting on with the job. And this is where the aircraft's reputation for being the forgotten V-bomber becomes genuinely baffling, because the Valiant's operational record is extraordinary. The first production aircraft entered RAF service in early 1955. By October 1956, a Valiant from 49 Squadron became the first British aircraft to drop a live atomic bomb. A blue Danube device detonated at the Maralinga Range in Australia. The following May, another 49 Squadron Valiant dropped Britain's first thermonuclear weapon over Christmas Island in the Pacific during Operation Grapple. The test, codenamed Short Granite, was supposed to produce a 1 megaton explosion. It fizzled at 300 kilotons, still 20 times the yield of the Hiroshima bomb, but it didn't matter. Britain had demonstrated that it was an independent thermonuclear power, and the Valiant was the aircraft that had proved it. Then came Suez. On the 31st of October 1956, Britain and France launched Operation Musketeer, an intervention to retake the Suez Canal after Egypt's President Nasser had nationalized it. Valiants bombed Egyptian airfields and communications targets in the first, and, as it turned out, the only combat missions flown by V-bombers until the Falklands War 26 years later. The high-altitude bombing results were mixed. The airfields weren't decisively knocked out, despite hundreds of tons of bombs dropped. But the Valiants themselves were untouchable. The Egyptian Air Force's MiG-15s, their most capable fighters at the time, couldn't reach them. One Egyptian pilot reportedly stood his MiG on its tail and fired his guns in a near-vertical climb, trying to get within range, but the rounds fell short. Beyond the nuclear and combat roles, Valiants pioneered aerial refueling for the RAF, supported long-range reconnaissance operations, and set multiple distance records. A 214 Squadron Valiant flew non-stop from England to Singapore, over 8,000 miles. The aircraft was the backbone of Britain's nuclear deterrent until the Victor and Vulcan reached full operational capability. It did everything that was asked of it, reliably, without complaint. George Edwards had promised an aircraft that would do the job. It did the job, and then the world changed. On the 1st of May, 1960, an American U-2 spy plane flown by Gary Powers was shot down over the Soviet Union by an SA-2 surface-to-air missile at over 60,000 feet. The implications were immediate and devastating for every air force that had built its strategy around high-altitude penetration. If the Soviets could knock down a U-2 at that altitude, a Valiant at 54,000 feet was no safer. The entire V-force had to rethink its approach. The answer was to go low and get under the radar, where ground clutter makes you hard to track and missiles have less time to react. By 1962, the Valiant was being switched to low-level tactical operations. The distinctive anti-flash white paint, designed to reflect the thermal pulse of a nuclear detonation, was stripped off in favor of camouflage. The Mach 1 Valiants were now performing in precisely the regime that only the Mach 2 had ever been designed to cope with. Think about that for a moment. The RAF had an aircraft specifically engineered for sustained low-level flight, and they had scrapped it because they decided low-level flying was yesterday's doctrine. Now, barely 4 years later, they were forcing the Standard Valiant, designed from the outset as a high-altitude platform with an airframe optimized for the smooth, thin air above 40,000 feet, to do the job the Black Bomber had been purpose-built for. The Mach 1's wing spars were constructed from a zinc-magnesium-copper-aluminium alloy called DTD-683. It was lighter and stronger than conventional aluminium. It was also, as it turned out, prone to stress corrosion cracking under repeated fatigue loads, exactly the kind of loads generated by flying fast and low in turbulent air. The fleet quietly deteriorated. Nobody knew it at the time. In July 1964, a Valiant from 543 Squadron on deployment to Rhodesia was found to have cracks in its rear wing spar. Then, on the 6th of August, came Taffy Foreman's flight, the starboard rear spar failing at altitude, the wing sagging, the one-sided landing at Gaydon. The RAF inspected the entire fleet and found wing spar fatigue across the fleet was running at between 35 and 75% of the assessed safe life, far beyond anything that could be attributed to normal service wear. Aircraft that should have had years of flying left were already structurally compromised. Some were cleared to continue flying, but restricted to a maximum speed of 250 knots, no more than 30 degrees of bank, half a G limit. Vickers began a repair program, but when engineers got deeper into the airframes, the damage was worse than initial inspections had suggested. On the 9th of December 1964, the last Valiant bomber sortie was flown by XD-8-18, the same aircraft that had dropped Britain's hydrogen bomb. Then the entire fleet was grounded. In January 1965, Dennis Healy, the new Defense Secretary under Harold Wilson's government, decided the Valiant wasn't worth the cost of repair and every aircraft was scrapped. The Valiant did everything the RAF asked of it. It was the first V-bomber into service, the first to drop a nuclear weapon, the first into combat, the first to pioneer aerial refueling. It carried Britain's nuclear deterrent while the Vulcan and Victor were still working up, and when the strategic picture shifted and the RAF needed an aircraft that could survive at low level, the Valiant tried to do that too, even though it was never designed for it. The aircraft that was designed for it had been scrapped 6 years earlier because the Air Ministry decided they'd never need it. They built the right plane, they tested the right plane, and then they threw it away. So that's it for today's video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. It goes a long way for us.